a long time ago, while I was mayor, we had this. We were out trying to do economic development in San Francisco, and while we were there doing the economic development, meaning we're trying to get companies to leave San Francisco and come to Phoenix, I met with about 30 companies, and Mayor Brown showed up at the meeting, which wasn't kind of a good thing because Mayor Brown was a complete powerhouse even back then as mayor. He later on became the head of the legislature and a couple of other things. But Willie's in the back of the room, and finally, when I get done speaking, Willie says, "All right, Mayor," he said, "you gave these guys a great talk about how wonderful a place Phoenix is and why it is that they should like it and why it is that they should relocate there." He says, "Why don't you tell them what it's like in June, July, and August?" And I said, Mayor Brown is exactly correct about that. He said, in fact, during those 3 months, all of our homeless pick up and move to San Francisco. So he said, "I'll get you, Mayor." This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Today, one of my co-hosts, Bob Robb, who's a syndicated columnist, you can find his columns on Substack. We're going to talk about the issue of what's happening in the Iran-Israel conflict, but we're going to look at it from a different point of view. I really want to try to spend more time talking about the why. We all know about what's happened with the bombing, and we've heard about how the president saw that and how the media has seen that. But the fundamental issue that I want to try to spend time on in this podcast is, why is it that Iran is such a long-term antagonist to Israel? Is there any real chance that they're ever able to overcome that? And I also want to think about our why, whether or not what we've done here is about our long-term strategic interests, or whether or not it's about values. I think that with Iran, it's more about values, but with the United States, we should talk about what our interests actually are. And on that, we're going to explore both how the far right sees it as well as the far left. In any event, if you like what it is that we're talking about here, you can find some of it in our new book called What's Right with America. If you like what we're doing, push that subscriber button and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and disticate and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right. Well, it's summer. And because it's summer, I think Henry is off in New Zealand. And Elliot, who knows where he's off? He's always flying someplace. But Bob and I are kind of still here in Arizona. I won't say stuck in Arizona, but we're still here in Arizona. Bob, I think, are you up in Munns Park, up in Flagstaff area today?
I actually relocated today to Phoenix. We're going to be spending the 4th of July holiday with my family in Portland.
Yeah, you can't miss that 114-degree weather here. You got to come when it happens. You got to be here for it, because sometimes it's hard to believe. Yeah, I walked out into the parking lot to go to my car. I swear to God, my feet were sticking to the asphalt as I was walking across it. But anyway, all right. So today, I'm hoping to just have a conversation with you about what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening with Israel and Iran. And, there's a lot of things that we could talk about on that. We had the bombing. We have issues about whether or not they completely destroyed the bunker. There are so many things that are being covered on this. But the issue that is interesting to me are the fundamental underlying issues that exists here, and what it is that's really driving the war. And I'd like to explore that from the right and from the left, from the progressive standpoint, the Tucker Carlson standpoint, and then also from our own standpoint. I've spent a little bit of time in the Middle East and got to know a number of people on both sides. I spent time in Saudi Arabia as well as in Israel. I've been in Jordan and other places in the Middle East, and began to really gain a flavor for how people think. I met with everything from academians to religious leaders, and I have kind of some of my own thoughts on it as well. But I'm going to play this video with Donald Trump. It's kind of an infamous video now, but I think that it does actually a good job of pointing out what I think is the biggest problem.
Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I'd never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. When I say, okay, now you have 12 hours you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because of one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
I'll tell you the interesting question to me on this, and I'll just play this before I ask you to talk about your article that you wrote on this last week on this particular issue. I think we oftentimes have a hard time understanding what they're doing, what is driving this issue, and I think it's because that we tend to have a view of life and being about prosperity, about how do we produce economic benefit for our citizens, and I think oftentimes we have a deeper misunderstanding when the issues go beyond that, like religious issues that oftentimes come into play. But you wrote a great article about this week that summarized the entire set of events. If you would, why don't you give us kind of a timeline as in terms of how you saw things, and then also the conclusions of your article?
Well, the first question is whether what the president did was within his constitutional authority. And I believe within the War Powers Resolution, the answer to that question is yes. The World War Powers Resolution says that if the president initiates what the act calls hostilities, he has to notify Congress. And if Congress doesn't approve of a continuation of those hostilities within 60 days, the president has to wind them up within an additional 30 days. And I think the important part, the most relevant part, is that the act assumes that presidents will engage in military action without it being pre-approved by Congress. It's in essence a way in which Congress in 1973 or 4 decided to balance its own war declaration authority with the modern world in which presidents exercising their Article 2 commander in chief authority feel the need to act either without time to notify Congress or, and I think this applies in this case, that a notification for Congress would undermine the mission. Can you imagine Congress sitting around deliberating whether we should bomb these nuclear facilities in Iran? It would have eliminated the mission. So I believe that within the War Powers Resolution, which is a decision by Congress with respect to its own war declaration authority of saying we're going to accommodate, we're going to give a space for the president to take action he deems in the national security. I believe that the answer to the question of whether he acted constitutionally is yes. However, I narrowly believe that it was an imprudent action nevertheless. Israel had decided the time had come for it to try to degrade to the extent possible Iran's nuclear capabilities. And had, in so doing, basically denuded Iran's air defense capabilities. So it created a unusual opportunity where, at much lesser risk, the United States could use its unique bunker busting capability to try to inflict more damage than Israel could inflict on its own, at least in the same period of time or as easily. But the reason why I think it was imprudent was illustrated by the clip you showed of Trump, in essence saying Israel is subservient to the United States in decisions that affect more directly Israel's security than they affect that of the United States. And the president put enormous pressure on Israel to terminate its activity to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities at a time where we don't know the extent to which they have been degraded and whether additional action is necessary from Israel's standpoint to do the extent of degrading of that capability that Israel thinks can be done. It is not in our interest, and it's not in Israel's interest for the United States to be making decisions and be perceived internationally as controlling Israel's own decisions as to what's in its best national interest. There were differing assessments of the extent to which Israel, acting on its own, could duplicate the damage that the dropping of the American buster busting bombs created. And the fact that Israel decided to go, I think it should have been left to Israel to decide when what can be accomplished has been accomplished. With the uncertainty as to what has been accomplished, having Trump, in essence, put pressure on Israel to stop now because he's unhappy that his declaration that we're done and it's now time for everyone to be peaceful and loving simply doesn't reflect necessarily the reality on the ground.
So I want to go to Israel and Iran's why for the war, but I want to spend a few minutes here before we do that on the American why. And I'm going to start with this. I've had many disagreements with Donald Trump on a variety of issues. Certainly, what we're doing on the budget today, I think, is a huge problem with deficits. I think what's taking place or with tariffs is a huge problem. And I worry about him on issues of the rule of law. But on this one, I actually give him an A across the board, right up until the final press conference that was done, or final press conferences that was done in terms of how they framed the war and the success. I see them so oftentimes step on their foot and tackle the media when there's no reason to. They actually, I think, could have taken a victory lap from what they had, and they would have received kudos for it. But I'm going to go back to this issue of why I give him an A. The idea that he has a group, the America First group, that doesn't want to be in any way, shape, or form taking part in this in the war or taking part in any type of foreign conflict is an interest group on his side that is pressure against him acting. He has cultivated that group. He has worked with that group. Many of the voices on that group have been given a voice because he gave it to them. For him to step up and to do this was he had to bow his back to that interest group. He had to make a decision that he believed that was right and that countered them. That's not easy in politics. Oftentimes, the inclination is to do something different. Now, I watched the process and I've listened to people, and I think it's a fair narrative to say that in the beginning, he didn't really want Israel to go in. I don't think he was really a supporter of it in the beginning. And I could see where maybe he had some FOMO and listening to reporters where he began to recognize the giant success that Israel had. But to me, that's kind of unimportant. That doesn't matter. Here's what matters. I do think we have an interest in making certain that Iran doesn't have a nuclear bomb. I don't know that we have an interest in as much of an interest in what Iran does in a variety of other places in the Middle East, including with Israel. But on the issue of them being able to get an atomic bomb, we have a very specific interest with nuclear proliferation and the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. I'm not sure. I've seen the reports that show where they violated the treaty. I've seen the reports that have shown that where they violated international law, and I've also seen people who have created arguments for why they haven't and why they're only acting in their best interest. But it is not in our interest in the United States for them to have a bomb. And the idea that after the airspace was cleared, after they had been pretty much defeated, at least in terms of their ability to respond, to utilize our B-2s and to go drop the bomb on Fordo, at least, makes a lot of sense to me for two very specific reasons. One is getting rid of the bomb. but I also think it helps Trump on the issue of deterrence. My worry was if, he's not acting in Ukraine, at least so far, in helping the Ukrainians against the Russians. If he hadn't have acted here, I think it would have just been a direct line for the Chinese to think that he wouldn't act in Taiwan. The idea that you have the capability isn't enough. You have to every now and then show that you're willing to use it. And his then pivot immediately back to looking for peace. I, if he were here, I'd give him a pat on the back. I think that in this particular instance, he did a really good job. So for you, when you say that in balance, and you did say that it was a close call, but for you, both the issue of trying to get rid of the atomic bomb as well as deterrence, those aren't important enough in the overall scheme of things to say that maybe he should have done it.
I think there's a strong case to be made that American action was warranted and should have taken place. I don't think that the threat of Iran having a nuclear weapon vis-a-vis the United States should be diminished at all. I think it should be taken very seriously. And Israel's success in denuding the air defenses that Iran had created a unique opportunity for the United States to take action that it could take that would not be easy for Israel to duplicate. So I think there's a very strong argument for taking action. And I wouldn't call it reckless at all. The reason why I think it's on balance imprudent is that I don't know that we finished the job. We don't know the extent of the damage. There are varying assessments of it. We may never know. But with Trump getting involved, as soon as that was done, he announced something that no one could know, that it was totally obliterated. Their ability to make nuclear weapons had been completely extinguished. And then he put pressure on Israel to abandon any additional effort. And I think it would have been better for the United States not to have become directly involved in the offensive part of the war. We were assisting Israel in defense against incoming missiles from Iran, which I think is appropriate, but I would think it would have been better if the United States had not gotten involved in the offensive part of the war and Israel was left free to do what it could do, and for Israel to decide when whatever could be done had been done and call a halt to it. I do not think that it enhances deterrence to a great deal because of the unusual circumstances. Israel had basically wiped out Iran's air defenses. So the risk to the United States of taking the action was substantially less than it otherwise would be. That's not a capability that can be duplicated in other hotspots. The Taiwanese can't do that to China. Ukraine can't do that to Russia, or Ukraine has very bravely prevented Russia from achieving air dominance over that particular war zone, but it's not going to succeed in denuding the air defenses of Russia. So the circumstances are so unusual, with Israel having done the really hard work of clearing the field for others to believe that this is a president that is willing to take tough action when those unique circumstances don't exist. So while I think it may have some deterrent value, I think it has very limited determined value. And from China's standpoint, what happens in Ukraine, I think, will be much more relevant to its calculation about an invasion of Taiwan than what has happened with Iran, with Israel, perhaps the most amazing military force in the world, having done so much to clear the ground before the president acted, particularly when it was clear that until Israel's success, that wasn't something that Trump was at all entertaining.
No, I tend to agree with that. I don't think that he was entertaining it, but I still come down to thinking that it was the right move based upon both deterrence, deterring other enemies, as well as I feel more comfortable knowing that Iran has been set back at least a couple of months or maybe a couple of years. I don't know what the number is on their ability to get an atomic bomb. Now, again, I'm going to come back to Pete Hegseth, their the Secretary of Defense. I think their way of framing it was terrible. I just sometimes don't understand why they stick their foot in their mouth on something where on this one the right framing was it doesn't matter whether or not they were obliterated. It matters that they know we will act and that we're not going to accept them having an atomic bomb. For me, that was enough for Trump to have done a victory lap on. And I think if had it been framed that way, it would have been very difficult for the media to have been in attack on that. Do you agree or disagree on that?
I agree that it was a terrible, terrible press conference, but it begins with Trump's reaction immediately after the bombs were dropped, when we had no ability to assess their effectiveness, declaring that Iran's nuclear capabilities had been completely wiped out, 100%. So now was the time to cease hostilities and to have peace. I don't know what a Secretary of Defense does when the chief executive officer, the commander in chief, has made that kind of announcement, except to defend it. And he was selected for his ability to defend what Trump says, irrespective of how ill-advised or ridiculous. And what would be compatible with your view of how they should have dealt with it would have been to leave space for Israel to take follow-up action if Israel thought that it was necessary. Israel's assessment seems to be that there has been substantial damage, but it was clear that Israel wanted to do additional efforts, perhaps not only directed at Iran's nuclear facilities, but also at its conventional weapon production capabilities, which Israel is the prime target for. So the way that you're describing would have been a smarter way to deal with it, but I think it would have required leaving space for Israel to take follow-up action if Israel thought that that would be productive.
Yeah, and if there's one thing I'm convinced of, having spent time in Israel even recently, that's a group that's going to act whether we want them to or not. They see this as existential, and they're going to do it. Secretary Hegseth, I found we'll play a little video here where he talks about in his press conference what he blamed on the media as being an unfair framing of the issue.
That because of the hatred of this press corps are undermined because your people are trying to leak and spin that it wasn't successful. It's irresponsible. And folks in this room are privy to that information because of the proximity here in the Pentagon. It's an important responsibility. And time again, classified information is leaked or peddled for political purposes to try to make the president look bad. And what's really happening is you're undermining the success of incredible B-2 pilots and incredible F-35 pilots and incredible refuelers and incredible air defenders who accomplished their mission, set back a nuclear program in ways that other presidents would have dreamed. How about we celebrate that?
Here's what I found to be interesting about the press conference, and I'd love to have your thoughts on this. It was important to them, if you listen to Secretary Hegseth and to President Trump, that there be a celebration of our victory. That seems to me to be what they wanted. He talked about, I can't believe you didn't talk about the great actions of our military, how great a mission it was, the intensity of it, the challenges that people have in the military, and what a great job that President Trump had done in being willing to do this. And I actually watched the media much more so this week than I have in other weeks because of this war. And I've listened to a number of podcasts. I actually found those things happening. There was a lot of discussion about those going on. Maybe not as much as they wanted, but they were there. The real issue became they wanted a celebration around it. And to me, I think that is not in President Trump's best interest. I don't think it's in the United States' best interest. I think the better thing that we should be doing from our own interest standpoint is to say, hey, we have to wait and see. We have to wait and see how successful these programs were. And more importantly, we have to wait and see how the Iranians react to this. Now, wanting peace, that makes a lot of sense to me. But having a celebration and a victory parade and talking about this thing being over, it may not be over. And if it's not over and you have to act again, it's going to make you look mighty foolish when you get down to that end and you have to go back in and do it again. The idea that you don't celebrate it leaves that door open. It was clear to me also the Iranians are watching our news. I think the Iranians made a massive mistake on this one, believing that President Trump would not act. And I think it's because they're listening to people like Tucker Carlson and other people who have been his advisors, believing that that's what would take place. Nonetheless, my point here is that this concept that Secretary Hegseth is on and the president was on, we need to have a giant celebration. I think that's an error.
I would thoroughly concur. It was a massive overreaction to the media coverage of the Defense Intelligence Agency's assessment that the damage that was done by the bombing was limited and would only set back the nuclear program by Iran by a matter of months. And the media did overplay that particular assessment, which was obviously leaked. And I think it's fair to conclude that it was leaked to try to take some of the bloom off the rose of what was a astonishing military strike by our fighting forces. But in terms, I mean, it was a preliminary assessment. It was stated with low confidence. There are other independent assessments that say that significant damage was done. The International Atomic Energy Commission's assessment is that there was substantial damage done. The assessment of a think tank headed up by David Albright, one of the most outstanding weapons inspectors, hugely experienced. He also believes that there was significant damage done. So that there was, and the press overplayed that particular assessment. The Trump administration overreacted to the play that it did get. But you are, I think, absolutely correct. It is in the nature of Donald Trump and the acolytes that he has appointed to high-ranking positions in the U.S. government that every action of his is to be celebrated. And that is both premature, given that we don't know the extent to which the damage has been done to Iran's nuclear programs, but it's also a tactical mistake. If you wanted to be in a position of positioning the United States, of trying to turn down the temperature in the Middle East, you don't do that by crowing in praise of yourself at the first dawn after you've dropped the bombs. So I agree with your assessment, but I also think that it's sort of implanted into the DNA of this particular administration.
And I loved Winston Churchill's speech a long time ago when they expected him to stand up and talk about how easy it was going to be to defeat the enemy. And he was smart enough to know, no, I have to stand up and tell them how difficult this is going to be, how hard it's going to be, because you have to harden the mind of our citizens to understand why we did this. And then there's no guarantee that it's going to be short run, but we are resolved. And being resolved to me is much better than a celebration. I want to turn to the why, and I listened a lot this week to a lot of different voices. I listened to people on the far left. I listened to people on the far right. I listened to libertarians, and then I listened to people from the military, trying to understand the differing positions and how they saw things. I want to start with this slide with Tucker Carlson on it. Tucker Carlson said, Americans are being led by the nose by a country the size of Austria. Now, this comment is a very interesting comment. You can find it on his Tucker show, but he goes much further than this in terms of his description of it. It's a sense that I gained from him that he believes that we have been manipulated by the Israelis, by Israel money, by their lobbying efforts to do things that are not in the American best interest. Now, he becomes very upset when there's any criticism of him that where people begin to believe that he looks anti-Semitic. And I don't know what's in Tucker Carlson's heart. I couldn't even begin to tell you. What I do know is that this comment sounds an awful lot like people who are anti-Semitic. The Ayatollah says, today the epitome of rebellion, arrogance, and tyranny is the U.S. government, which is controlled by wealthy Zionist individuals and corporate owners. Now, what is he trying to spin? He's been trying to spin this literally since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, or certainly the Ayatollah Khomeini, his predecessor, was trying to spin that. And that is that there's this giant Zionist conspiracy. In fact, I believe the very fundamental purpose in many ways of the Islamic Revolution is to promote that single concept. But it's an attempt to try to make it look like Americans and others are simply under the control of people who are Zionists. And that takes you to the next comment. Wherever the Jew has gained influence, he breaks the will to live of the people, robs them of their character, undermines their morality, and makes them cowardly. In foreign policy, he pursues a goal to make nations fight each other and to profit from one another. This was from Mein Kampf, Volume 1, Chapter 11, back in 1925. Here's the point that I'm making, or maybe it's a question as opposed to a point. I'm not certain what the Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon side's trying to do. Again, I don't know what's in their heart, but it seems to me, in listening to long versions of their conversation, they are really appalled by the fact that they believe that there is an undue influence that comes from the Jewish community, the Zionist community, and from Israel to drag us into conflicts that we haven't, that we shouldn't be in. Many of them believe the whole reason that we were in Iraq was because of them, that they were the fundamental underpinnings of that. Now, again, I disagree with that. I think that we have an interest. By the way, I think this is a really interesting question. One of the things I've heard from leaders over and over again is the concept of people go to war for interest, not for values. I don't know that that's true in this particular case, but nonetheless, I think that we have had an interest, and we do have an interest today. If you could, help me strongman what you may think that Tucker Carlson is trying to say. And then after strongmanning that or steelmanning it, if you would give me kind of your point of view and how you differ from it.
Well, I don't think there's any question that Israel has a disproportionate influence on U.S. foreign policy and military policy. And it's as a result of three factors. One is the affiliation with the nation by fundamentalist Christians who are a powerful force within the Republican Party. It's in part geopolitics. It is a democracy in a troublesome and troubled region of the world that is an ally of the United States and has been demonstrated since the attack by Hamas on Israel. One of the most formidable and skilled intelligence and defense operations in the entire world. So those are people that you want on your side, particularly when they share your values. And third, the Jewish population in the United States is well organized politically and participates sensibly and successfully in terms of American politics. It's not at all unusual that that affinity for a home country or a country that has a special relationship to the Jewish people would express themselves in organized political activity in the United States. We got involved in trying to resolve the Irish conflict in significant part because of the Irish politicians that were in leadership positions at the time. We invested heavily in that. You have that affinity for a home country or where your ethnicity uh, originated from that affects American politics and far beyond. There's nothing unusual about what the Jewish people are doing. They're just very good and successful about it. There's nothing untoward or unusual about any of that. But I also don't think that it is per se anti-Semitic to point out the third influence, which is the fact that the Jewish people play politics, American politics, very successfully in influencing the direction of our foreign policy and our military policy. I think it's faintly anti-Semitic not to acknowledge the other two factors, the fundamentalist Christian affiliation with the country and Israel's geopolitical significance and position. So I do think you've got a little bit of a flavor of anti-Semitism from American actors who only concentrate on that third factor. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is anti-Semitism or directed by it. It's clear that the clerical regime in Iran is and has been since 1979 anti-Semitic. They openly express anti-Semitic views, and it is a fundamental rationale for their entire military and foreign policy um, uh, uh, policies and approaches, and they have had a stated objective of eliminating the country of Israel, of destroying it. And they set up their proxy groups to try to put pressure on Israel. And they finally, one of those proxy groups, Hamas, went so far as to trigger Israel's extraordinarily successful effort to destroy those proxies and degrade Iran's direct threat to the country. So I believe we shouldn't ignore the extent to which anti-Semitism, which is a direct threat to the existence of Israel, motivates the clerical regime in Iran. I think we should be careful how we discuss that in the context of American politics.
Right. And so again, if you listen to this far right debate, the way they try to make it sound is if the Americans have never not done what the Jewish lobby asked them to do. And first, that's just not factually correct. Right? It is factually correct that Harry Truman, back in 1947, was a key person on the issue of establishing Israel. And I personally think that was the right thing to do, but there were other factors, including the relationship that you talked about between Christian and Judaism that came into play on that. But almost immediately then wouldn't fund them on the war. In fact, if you look at the 1947, 1948 war, almost all of that was funded by the Soviets, believe it or not. I mean, they were utilizing their weapons, they were utilizing their planes because we wouldn't give it to them. And in Israel, they believe, had it not been for the Soviets on that, they wouldn't have been successful. Later on, when Eisenhower came into play, he wasn't necessarily supportive on many issues that was going on with them and with Egypt. Now, Kennedy became a changing card in this. He fully embraced Israel for a variety of different reasons, most of which I think were strategic, not politically strategic, but strategic for the United States. And then you have the Islamic Revolution. And the Islamic Revolution, the question that I think we often ask with the Islamic Revolution, we'll spend more time on this in a moment, but is their goal about hegemony, or is their goal about just their hatred for Americans and Jews? Neither way is it good for us, because if it's about their hatred for us, then it's probably impossible for us to overcome. But if it's about the issue of hegemony, that's a real challenge to the Saudis and to the ability for us to be able to make certain that those resources that are important for certainly the rest of the world, they have been important for us at periods of time, for us to be able to maintain some type of equilibrium in that process. It's kind of Henry Kissinger's whole concept of the balance of nations and why that becomes important. But either way, it's just simply not correct that we've always been led by the nose by them, that we've always been in a position where we haven't been willing to disagree. In fact, I think Donald Trump, there was some disagreement going on with Israel during this war, both at the beginning and certainly in that clip that we played at the end. I don't, I give Donald Trump credit for what I think his intention is on this. He has said enough times that he is concerned about peace that I actually have begun to believe him. I believe that is a big issue to him. Now, I happen to believe you will not get to peace if you don't have a deterrence. If people believe you won't act, you'll get the exact opposite of peace. But if we can, unless you have something to add on that, I'd like to go to the left, because I think that the left has a little bit of a different interpretation on this. And on this one, I'm not going to use a comment directly on Iran, but I am going to use something that I found to be interesting this week in left-wing politics. The next slide was by the Democratic nominee for the New York mayor. I believe you say his name, Zohran Mamdani. He's actually Indian. I believe he has a Syrian wife, if I'm correct. But if you read his post, I encourage you, go back and look at his post, and look at the post that he put up one day after October the 7th. Now, October the 7th was a horrendous day for Israel. If you think back on it, that was the day that Hamas had overcome the line and they killed innocent people. I was there a month after it happened, and it's just hard to describe how bad it was. This wasn't just military against military. This was a group of kids at a concert that they murdered. It was, I saw a video of two little boys with their father, where their father was blown up, and the kids were somewhat abused by the military who came in after that. It was a horrendous day. He makes a post that kind of blames Israel for October the 7th. Now, he's a little balanced in his first sentence, but it's clear if you look at the overwhelming theme of this and a sense that he blames Israel for the problem. He sees it as an apartheid, as he calls it. And immediately, instead of saying, hey, we feel bad for what happened to Israel, we're terrible about what happened to our Jewish friends, he immediately goes on the attack to try to make it look like it's a balanced deal. Here's what I think is taking place on this. I think the left wants to see the history of what's happened in Iran. By the way, they constantly do this. I see it on a constant basis. The United States, they never justify, ever. They never justify the actions of Israel. They do justify the actions of Hamas. They do justify the actions of Iran. They do justify the other side. And they do it by talking about all these things that they think that we did wrong. Now, I'm not here to say that we haven't done things wrong, because clearly I think what happened in 1953 by the United States and by the British military, or by the British, it was a mistake. The mistake was our CIA got involved, and we were actively engaged in overthrowing the democratically led government inside of Iran. And what that resulted in was the Shah gained full power, and the Shah did some things that weren't, I'm not trying to defend him in any way, but he did some things that would have been upsetting. But what that led to was a revolution. And their view is that led to the Islamic Revolution. And the answer is that's not really true. it led to a democratic revolution. In the beginning, there were lots of different groups who thought that they were going to reestablish democracy. What the Islamic group did, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, is they put into place a system that basically murdered most of the people who were on the democratic side, and they created a theocracy. They created a very brutal regime that's been very tough on anyone who's not a full believer in the things that they are trying to promote. But nonetheless, the left likes to blame the problems that took place in 1953. That's the reason for why the Islamic Revolution happened. I think what that does, it misses a whole lot of things. First, it misses the whole idea that Muhammad had a division amongst his people in terms of who was going to inherit the kingdom. And that created a division between Sunnis and Shias. And that division is one of the divisions that exists in the Middle East today. And it oftentimes is just as big a division as between them and the Jews. But the real challenge, I think, that happened that created this problem was the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of the Ottoman Empire happened right after World War I. The Ottomans and Germans bound together as a team in World War I, and the result of that was the Ottomans lost. When they lost, they were broken apart. Right, wrong, or indifferent, they were broken apart into many different countries. That, I think, created a psychological shift amongst Arabs and Muslims in a belief that had they have been closer to God, closer to Allah, that wouldn't have happened. That's part of why the extremist movement, I think, plays out oftentimes in the Middle East. But just as importantly, there was a sense of that somehow or another that made them feel inferior to Americans, inferior to the British. And then the worst of all things happened. Israel today is not the place where Jews went. Israel is the place where the poorest Jews went. The Jews who had money came to the United States. That's what they did. It doesn't matter if it was the Russian pogroms or if it was what was taking place in Germany. If you had money, this was the promised land. For people who didn't have money, they walked in. And the idea that they feel defeated by them has an incredible psychological effect on Iran and oftentimes on Muslims and Arabs in that region. The point that I'm trying to make here is that I see the left doing nothing any different than what the far right is doing. I probably shouldn't be calling on you to strongman their argument, but nonetheless, give me what you think might be kind of the best that's going on that side and your thoughts of what's taking place with them.
Well, certainly the framework in parts of the left is that this is a colonial oppressor in Israel and oppressed people in the Palestinians. And the reality is that this is a stretch of land that both the Jews and the Palestinians have deep ancestral roots and traditions in. And the efforts to provide a two-state solution, which came closest to being achieved at the end of Bill Clinton's administration, where he had negotiated with Israel about as favorable a two-state solution as the Palestinians could hope for. And Yasser Arafat turned it down. So you have a situation where you've got deep history and so far no formulation for living peacefully together. So I think that the plight of the Palestinian people who have been badly served by their political leadership, for which the Palestinians are substantially to blame. When George W. Bush insisted on there being a election in Palestine, before he would continue to try to broker some sort of land for peace deal. The Palestinians voted for Hamas to be the parliamentary majority in that election. So there hasn't been, from the Israeli standpoint, even when Israel was prepared to try to share the land with some measure of substantial and real sovereignty for the Palestinian people, even when the Israeli political environment seemed to be prepared for that, the Palestinians turned it down and showed no interest in accepting the reality and the existence of Israel in any kind of borders compatible with a sovereign and independent Israel. And since then, the political environment within Israel has changed, where there's not much interest in Israel anymore for a two-state solution. But I do believe that concern for the plight of the Palestinians, and particularly a anxiety and emotional sense about what's happening in Gaza, isn't out of bounds politically and is appropriate. If it weren't set into the context of this being a colonial power oppressing a people who ought to have the rightful ownership to all the land. I mean, Palestine, from the river to the sea, is a call for the annihilation of Israel. And that is the chant that you hear from this element of the left. As I've frequently mentioned on this show, I don't think the United States should be in the position of second guessing or trying to control what Israel decides that it needs to do for its own national defense. However, as an individual, and not proposing that it direct U.S. policy at all, I don't understand what Israel thinks that it's accomplishing in terms of its own future security with the destruction that's occurring so broadly in Gaza. I understand the rationale to try to get rid of every element of Hamas that Israel possibly can. But the price that's being paid in terms of the future, with the embitterment that has to be taking place among the people of Gaza, I'm not sure has been fully baked into the calculations that Israel is making as to what it thinks it needs to do for its own national security. But going back to your original question, I think the best you can say for what's happening on the left is that there is reason to be concerned, deeply concerned, about the fate of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I think there is a reason to be concerned about it, but I think it's always about their framing. And again, I listened to many podcasts this week from people on the left. The constant framing of what happened in Iran sounds very similar to the framing that they had for what happened on October 7th. And that is, we're the bad guys. The United States is the bad guys. Britain's the bad guys. Israel is the bad guys. And as you said, it's framed in this colonialism, oppressor versus victim type mindset, which totally ignores a whole lot of history. I mean, I don't want to take away from what happened in 1953 in Iran. It's a thing. It's a thing, but it's not the only thing. There were lots of things that led to the Iranian Revolution. And in any respect, it's not only not good for us, it's not good for the people of Iran. What I find interesting about Iranians, you and I both know Iranians in Arizona who've been incredibly successful. That's a story that's true all over the world. Iranians are incredibly successful people when they get out from underneath the Islamic Party or the Islamic Revolution that took place in Iran itself. So when we come to Hamas, I don't know the answer any longer on that. I've always been a believer in the two-state solution. I've listened to Bill Clinton say directly he believed that the problem was Arafat in reaching a deal at Long End. He talks about in Camp David where he literally brought in an interpreter and went through it word by word in the agreement because he thought the agreement was so good for the Palestinians. It gave them back half of Jerusalem. There were a whole set of things that I would guess the Israelis are happy about that they didn't sign today. But nonetheless, it was an agreement that was geared in their favor. The reason they can't come to an agreement is because they're not looking to share the land. That's the Palestinians, at least people like Hamas and Arafat, they'd have no desire for a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, their state. If you listen to the Iranians, they talk about, we don't have a problem with Jews being here. It's Zionist. And Zionist kind of becomes a bad word oftentimes on the right and the left. But all it really means is Jews who believe that they have a right to have a homeland, right? And if you believe that you have a right to have a homeland or they have a right to have a homeland, you can have two states. But if you believe they shouldn't even have a right to have a Zionist there, meaning anyone who believes that they should have a right to a homeland, you're back to a one-state solution. It's just one state on the other side. And the challenge I think Israel has today, if you went to the West Bank and actually set up free elections that elect Hamas, that's what would happen today. So I don't think that alleviates the ability for a two-state solution, but I think it's, if you do have one at this point, it would have to clearly be phased in. You know, we did this with Japan years ago, which was, we didn't really just walk in and give them freedom. We started, MacArthur was fairly brilliant at how he established it, but he created a process where over time, as the thinking began to change, it would increasingly become more democratic. And I think that's what you'd have to do here. You'd have to create some type of judiciary that had some type of constitutional rights for people, because if you let Hamas run it today, forget about what they're going to do to the Jews. You don't want to be a female. You don't want to be gay. You don't want to be anybody who doesn't think along their strict lines of the orthodoxy and how they see their religion. That's not really freedom. That to me would be a huge mistake. It has to be set up based upon, how do you get to something that's closer to Western values? And that's where we always have a challenge, because the question is, do you want democracy or do you want Western values, right? And oftentimes the conflict there is, well, what if democracy leads you back to a very hard-line religious group who takes rights away from people and wants to go back to war with Israel?
I've always had a slightly different view of the answer to that question. And that is, if a Islamist group is elected in a democratic election, I would like to see that string roll out, because the act of governing is a temporizing influence and brings into play other considerations between you and the electorate. I think we and Israel made a mistake when Hamas was given parliamentary control in the aughts by saying, we're going to have nothing to do with them, as opposed to let them go through the process of governing, which is, from your experience as mayor, is a tough job and brings in a lot of considerations. I oppose the Egyptian coup to depose the Islamist, the Muslim Brotherhood elected president, who was at the point of having to confront what he was willing to accept in terms of being more of a pluralistic governor. That was cut short. The only place that we actually allowed that to sort of roll out was in Tunisia. And I think we made a mistake. The United States made a mistake because you had a Islamist government that stated a desire to govern pluralistically, and it simply never could get its economy going. And so now it's deteriorated into more of a failed state. And I think the United States missed an opportunity to try to help Tunisia be a successful example of that evolution, because there was a commitment to make that evolution by the government at the time. So I think that you begin with democracy, because a democratically elected government has a popular mandate of some sort. Let them deal with the tough issues of governance. And I think it's not until there's an elected representative of the Palestinian people willing to accept Israel's existence and to negotiate in good faith a sharing of the land that we will ever get out of this tinderbox of hostilities. Now, that's a minority view. I openly confess, but I've always thought
Well, let me.
that cutting off that process, as we did with Hamas and Israel, as was done with Egypt with the military coup, was a mistake. And I don't think it could have turned out worse if we had allowed that process to continue.
So I'm going to play out my thesis here, and you can agree or disagree with it. But I'd like to play it right into this question or this comment that you just made. So I believe in Iran. The real underlying factor that has led them to war is they really do hate Israel. They hate fundamentally even the concept of Jews being on their homeland. Now, my personal opinion is that really is remnant of what happened with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It was a disgrace that they feel had fell upon them, and it was a religious slur in their own right. But regardless of what the psychological motivation was, you only have to listen to the Ayatollah for a very short period of time, and he can't talk without talking about the evils of Israel. And that's true since the very beginning of the revolution. I don't think you're going to overcome that. I just don't. I think that at the end of the day, they're the existing government of Iran today is so based upon having that straw man. I don't think they're going to abandon that concept in any way, shape, or form. On the other hand, we're talking about how you might create a government in the West Bank or in Gaza that would work. And the idea that you talk about establishing a democracy first and then allowing them to play out, I agree with you. I mean, if I found out anything in being mayor, being ideological just doesn't fix a pothole. It just doesn't deliver a police officer in 3.5 minutes. Somewhere along the line, you got to get down to talking about operational issues and how things work. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for ideology in the government process, but overwhelmingly, you have big delivery issues that you have to deal with. And if you get too far down the ideological rabbit hole, you can't do it. It starts to become an impediment. So my question that I would have for you and your concept, would you put guardrails on them? Would you have guardrails to make certain that there were civil rights, human rights, equal rights, property rights, any of those types of protections around individuals? Or would you allow them through a democratic means to be able to do away with those rights that individuals would have? Would you establish a separate court system, or would you try and ensure that when they did go through their election process, that it was a fair election? Because you can also, in a democracy, get rid of fair elections fairly easily if you're in control of the government. Would you put guardrails on it, or would you just allow them to operate and see what happened?
Given the security interest of Israel, there's going to be some form of a protectorate as an interim state in any event. And there will be guardrails to provide for security, and undoubtedly guardrails to also provide some of those fundamental rights that you described. But a Islamist political party will want to have an Islamist republic. And we agreed to a constitution for Iraq, which declared itself to be an Islamic republic. And with Sharia law being a significant element of its civic values. Israel is a Jewish state. One of the reasons why there's never been support for basically annexing the Palestinian parts of our neighboring parts of Israel is that if you had a greater Israel and it remained democratic, it wouldn't be very long before the Palestinians were in charge because they would outnumber the Jews. And it is, by its declaration, a Jewish state. And there are provisions such as not allowing students in the really right-wing religious orders from being subject to conscription. It's something that it is a division within the body politic of Israel. Now, these are antithetical structures from the American point of view, which is that we are a pluralistic society and government should be neutral with respect to religion. So I would, in my thought experiment, I wouldn't try to constrain beyond the fundamental security interests, fundamental human rights, what a Islamist governing party stood for or sought to accomplish. Because I believe the hard task of actually governing and delivering would have its own moderating influence. And our efforts to dictate that, either by fiat from on top or refusing to engage with the Islamist government in terms of Hamas, or largely accepting a military coup in Egypt, hasn't produced good results. So I can't with any confidence predict where that ends up, but it seems to me that there's reason to allow that process to work itself out. There was some hope that you were seeing that in Turkey, where you had an Islamist party take over. Its original focus was on economic prosperity. It governed in mostly a pluralistic way. It aspired to be part of the European Union. That's now evolved into sort of an Hungarian-style autocratic government. So that particular real-life experiment has had its disappointments, but I don't see what the alternative is to allowing an evolution of these Islamist political organizations dealing with the hard job of governing and seeing whether that tempers them and makes them more accepting of peace with their neighbors. It's awfully hard to govern. I mean, the time that the Palestinians had their best economic opportunity was pre-Oslo, when there was open interaction with the highly successful Israeli economy. And once you got once you had post-Oslo, you created barriers, and then you had the security threats, and you had more barriers. So if you want to be a governing party for Palestine, um, your best chance of success is to be highly integrated with the Israeli economy. That's the way that you would have the best chance of improving the standard of living for the people that you represent.
Yeah, and for me, by the way, you mentioned Turkey. I spent time in Turkey, and I actually think, well, you wouldn't guess it today with Erdogan and the challenges that exist. I actually think there's a great alliance available at some point in the near future between Turkey and Israel, mainly because both sets of people think very similar. I mean, there's certainly a religious divide, but if you go to Istanbul, it's just incredibly obvious that that the two people think very similar. My own personal opinion in the West Bank and in Gaza is I'd like to see a two-state solution, but I would put lots of guardrails on it, and I would allow it to evolve over time. But I do think that it starts with allowing certainly an Islamic party that can run, but I think you're going to have to work really hard to put into place basic human rights and property rights. Without human rights, civil rights, equal rights, and property rights, as well as free markets, I don't think you're going to have. It won't be successful anyway because they won't have the right conditions to find themselves with an economic success. And I think if you start with that and you give that to people, it would then be very difficult to take back away. So I'm going to go to my last question here. If you would play the Tulsi Gabbard video. I think it's really interesting to see what Trump's intelligence director actually put out as a video. This is about a week before the actual bombing.
I recently visited Hiroshima in Japan and stood at the epicenter of a city that remains scarred by the unimaginable horror caused by a single nuclear bomb dropped in 1945, 80 years ago. Yet this one bomb that caused so much destruction in Hiroshima was tiny compared to today's nuclear bombs. As we stand here today, closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before, political elite and warmongers are carelessly fomenting fear and tensions between nuclear powers. Perhaps it's because they are confident that they will have access to nuclear shelters for themselves and for their families that regular people won't have access to. So it's up to us, the people, to speak up and demand an end to this madness. We must reject this path to nuclear war and work toward a world where no one has to live in fear of a nuclear holocaust.
There are a couple of things that I find to be interesting about this particular video. By the way, the first one is, if you ask me, that was her death sentence. She's done. I didn't hear one time in there about how great Donald Trump was. I didn't hear one time in that video how he has solved all the world's problems. I didn't hear one time in there why he is the guy to save us from this. And I think I could be wrong, but I think that's an ultimate sin in his behalf. That looked like it was self-aggrandizing. Looked like it was about her as opposed to him. And I don't think he's going to like that. Second thing I don't think he should like, I think she was trying to box him in. I think she was trying to box him in around this concept of it's the industrial military complex that is a problem. Third thing that was a problem was that little dig about, well, the people who are pushing for this. There are people really pushing for a nuclear war, and they're doing it because they have shelters and because they're rich and because they don't care. Multiple problems with that. It ignores the idea that if you don't have a significant deterrent, I think you actually could end up in a nuclear war. It's the deterrence that stops that from happening. But the last issue is, I don't know how anybody can think she's giving now good intelligence. I mean, it's very clear she has now an ideology and a philosophy that she's trying to feed. Even if you agree with it, you can't help but look at that and then realize she says to Congress there's no threat of a bomb. And then right afterwards, after Trump decides to go in, she says, oh, well, actually there was. And then she's doing a video that seems to be kind of purporting her own opinion. In the end, what you want from your intelligence is intelligence. I don't know that that's what Trump wants, and I think that it's not a new thing that presidents want intelligence that support what it is that they're trying to do. But at the end of the day, having an intelligence agency that can give you differing information is a really, really important thing. I'd love to have your thoughts on the video, but I'd also love to have your thoughts on this. Do you see the industrial military complex as being a significant problem in the United States? And do you think there are a group of people out there who really don't care about nuclear war?
I certainly don't believe that the people out there who don't care about nuclear war. There is a problem with our military industrial complex. It's old and dilapidated and incapable of performing the job we need it to perform. We need to seriously invest in our military infrastructure and our ability to produce the stuff we're going to need if ever, unfortunately, we go to war. So we have the opposite problem of it being too powerful of a force. It's in too dilapidated a state. With respect to the video, I mean, this is the director of national intelligence. Her job, ostensibly, is to assimilate all the vast intelligent gathering operations of the other agencies and synthesize it in order to give the president the best possible view of the situation that he faces. And I think most presidents have wanted independent intelligence assessments prior to making a decision. I mean, once a president makes a decision, obviously they want support for that decision, and there might be some selective use of the intelligence that had been gathered in order to support that particular position. But prior to making the decision, every president should want an unvarnished, untainted intelligence product in order to make decisions that don't come with problems and obstacles that could have been anticipated if you had gotten an unvarnished depiction of what our intelligence agencies thought about the situation at hand. She wasn't a serious pick for this position. And I don't think that you can accept any intelligence product produced by this administration because that isn't something that this particular president seems interested in. But shame on her for making an inappropriate public comment. I mean, this is someone who should be in the shadows, not someone who should be making videos and creating her own political persona on a particular issue. Shame on Trump for that being someone that he wanted to be as his director of national intelligence, and shame on Republicans in the Senate for confirming her. She was self-evidently the wrong person, completely the wrong kind of person for this particular job.
Yeah, it's one of my big complaints with the Trump administration, which is sometimes it's difficult to see the difference between what they think is good policy and the important role that you have to play in feeding his ego. And the reason that I say that is he makes a lot of decisions that are short term. A lot of the one thing you can always count on for the Trump supporter is they don't really want to tell you what they think until Trump tells you what he's doing, and then they'll tell you how brilliant that was and it was the right move because they're just on his side no matter what. Again, I'm going to go back to I think he did a great job on this one. But when I look at the flaws, I'm going to point out two flaws that I think are a real challenge for him. He picked Tulsi Gabbard because he was mad at the CIA because he thought that they were out to get him. And I think he wanted to do a purging. That was what he was doing in the very beginning. He was on a vengeance tour. But at the end of the day, he's got to be president. And when you got to be president, I think the person whose job it is to keep secrets and give you intelligence ought to be a person that you can trust to give you good intelligence. And number two, they ought to be a person that can keep a secret. They shouldn't be the person on a video trying to outdo you or push you into a corner. The mistake that he made was he didn't pick something that was really in his long-term interest in being president of the United States. Personally, I think he sees that. it was obvious to me when he said, I don't think she knows what she's talking about. I think he left the F word out of that one, but it was very clear to me he wasn't happy with the information that she had given. The other issue that I think happens is that when you're focused on the ego, you're focused on these short-term solutions. And I think that's what led him to saying, and then people supporting him and saying, how grand a success this was in terms of how we obliterated it. Nobody could have ever done what Donald Trump had done here ever. It's just unnecessary. He did I think, a very presidential thing. He took a very tough action. He bowed his back against his own interest groups. There's so much that's evident in what he did. You can agree or disagree with the action at the end of the day. But in a way, the less said, the better when you get done with that. You're always going to have your enemies. You're always going to try to frame it as why it is that they think that it's a terrible thing. You don't make them go away by talking about how you're the greatest that ever lived. You would do much better by just allowing the people who support your action to do that. So in any event, my read at the end of this is he just has this tendency to let those worst instincts in his nature to get in his way of what could be the great instincts within his nature. I'll give you the last word, Bob.
I would concur, except I'm not sure he has instincts other than the desire to make it all about him all the time.
Yeah, well, for me, it's important for myself to give him the benefit of a doubt. I also think no matter what, he's our president for 4 years. So I think it's helpful to all of us to try to find his positive traits. And I had promised you to give you the last word, but I guess I would just say I actually am believing him that peace is an important thing to him. I don't believe he's going about it the right way other than what he did this last week. And this last week, I give him good marks. All right. I appreciate it, Bob. Thanks for being on. This was a fun conversation.
Always good to be with you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.